Missouri, 1889. The Ozarks stretched in fractured ridges, their slopes shadowed and uneven. Nestled among them lay a hollow, a narrow valley where the river ran gray after storms, and the soil exhaled a faint, smoky scent even when no fire burned. Travelers said the mist hovered longer here, coiling in pale spirals that vanished only reluctantly, as if the hollow itself hesitated to release it. Into this landscape came Margaret Vale, recently widowed, a schoolteacher from St. Louis. She arrived quietly in a horse-drawn carriage, her black wool dress stiff with mourning, her bonnet shadowing eyes that had already seen too much. She purchased the abandoned parsonage at the hollow's far end, the one with the cracked bell tower, the shuttered windows, and the garden choked with nettles. For years, it had waited empty, attended only by the wind and the occasional crow. The town noticed. Gossip began immediately. Mrs. Halloway at the general store whispered to anyone within earshot. She tends fires at night, but no chimney ever smokes. The postmaster's ledger corroborates this. In March 1889, he wrote, "Margaret Vale has arrived. Polite, quiet, yet no letters sent or received. Odd presence." A single photograph survives, its sepia edges curling. Margaret standing in the parlor doorway, her gaze directed somewhere unseen, her shadow cast unnaturally long against the floor. Some claimed it captured not merely a woman, but the hollow itself, suspended in a single, still moment. Margaret's first act each evening was to ring a handbell, precisely at dusk. Its sound carried far across the hollow, touching fields, fences, and the river, marking the hour her husband had left, and perhaps the hour she returned to a world that no longer waited for her. And then there was the smoke, thin, curling above the roofline, yet never rising from the chimneys, not from the hearth, not from any discernible fire. It lingered like a question, caught in some invisible web, and the townsfolk whispered about signals they could not understand. Those who dared approach found the door locked, the paths untrodden, save for her careful steps, and always, at dusk, the bell rang. Reflection. Even the quietest arrival can awaken a valley and set rumors in motion. Missouri, late spring 1889. Days grew longer. The river swelled with spring rains, and Ash Hollow seemed to watch the new occupant with deliberate patience. Margaret Vale's routines were exacting. She rose at dawn, swept the parsonage floors, polished the wooden bell in the tower, and tended the overgrown garden with quiet precision. Yet no one saw her move from inside the house, only glimpses through open windows. The townsfolk began taking notes, consciously or unconsciously. Farmers who passed the hollow swore her voice carried across the fields, soft, measured, reciting psalms through open windows at noon. One neighbor recorded in a notebook, "The sound is gentle, yet echoes as if the house itself repeats it." Ledger fragments discovered decades later suggest a woman preparing meticulously for some unknown purpose. Oil purchased in small quantities, salt kept in neat jars, blank paper stacked by the ream. It was as though she expected letters to arrive or leave, but the postmaster found none. Evenings in Ash Hollow grew stranger. Thin columns of smoke rose from the parsonage roof, yet no chimney bore a flame. The smoke lingered in the air like a veil, then vanished without dispersing. Some farmers swore it was a bad omen. Churchgoers said she was penitent, praying to God for forgiveness. Others, more practical, whispered that she was cursed. Then came the first proof that would haunt the town's memory. An itinerant photographer passing through captured Margaret twice in a single frame. In the double exposure, she appeared reading a book by the window, while simultaneously standing at the parlor door. Townsfolk who saw the photograph whispered it was impossible, and some swore it was evidence of something unnatural. Margaret's bell, rung each evening at dusk, became the hollow's constant. Farmers paused their work. Children ran to the fence to listen, and even the river seemed to slow, as though in deference. No one dared ask why she rang it. She did not answer. By the end of the first month, Ash Hollow had already begun to shape her legend. In whispers, people said, "The widow is here. She walks with the smoke. She counts the hours differently than the rest of us." Reflection. The smallest gestures can echo, especially in a place that waits for them. Missouri, summer 1889. Ash Hollow had settled into a rhythm around Margaret Vale, though no one could say it was a normal one. Dawn brought the soft hiss of wind through nettles and the gray river flowing low. And within the parsonage, Margaret moved as though time obeyed her alone. Ledger fragments discovered years later tell of meticulous purchases: oil for lamps, salt in precise measurements, and stacks of blank paper, by the ream, suggesting correspondence never sent. Her days were punctuated by quiet, deliberate acts: sweeping the floor, arranging herbs in neat rows, reading psalms aloud through open windows. The sound drifted over fences and across the river, gentle but persistent. On some mornings, smoke rose from the parsonage roof, thin, pale curls that shimmered in the sunlight, yet no chimney bore flame, no hearth roared with fire. Neighbors claimed the smoke, stood still like it knew its shape mattered. Children would watch, daring each other to step closer, only to retreat when the bell rang sharply at noon, her private signal marking an hour no one else seemed to understand. The farmers who approached her cautiously reported her calm, almost otherworldly composure. She greeted them softly, sometimes offering water or bread, but never spoke of her late husband. Churchgoers were divided. Some thought her saintly, a woman in penance. Others whispered that she was cursed, that her rituals were a dark mirror of devotion. A traveling photographer, passing through Ash Hollow in July, captured the hollow's first oddity in permanent form: a double exposure. Margaret appeared twice in the same frame, reading at the window, yet simultaneously standing at the doorway. The townsfolk, when shown the photograph, were unsettled. Some swore it was impossible. Some swore it was proof of what they had long suspected: that Margaret Vale existed slightly apart from ordinary time. Even the natural world seemed to bend around her presence. A drought settled across the region that summer. Fields cracked, and the river ran lower than ever, yet faint columns of smoke appeared above the parsonage and the hills, even when no fires burned. Some whispered of miracles, others of curses. The hollow itself seemed to hum with expectation, a valley attuned to a woman who did not entirely belong. Reflection. Daily life can be ordinary, yet in the right place and time, it can become inexplicably extraordinary. Missouri, summer 1889. The heat lingering over Ash Hollow like a silent witness. The parsonage stood firm against the sun, its walls pale with age, its windows catching the light like watchful eyes. Margaret Vale's days had taken on an eerie rhythm, each action deliberate, each sound measured. Ledger entries reveal meticulous attention: purchases of salt in small, precise amounts, lamps oiled and polished with devotion, and blank paper stacked in neat piles, unused but waiting. There were no letters written or sent, yet some pages bore cryptic notations, almost like calculations, almost like prayers. The hollow seemed to hum in acknowledgement of her presence. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the smoke. On certain mornings, columns rose from the roof and drifted lazily across the river. But come afternoon, the smoke had vanished. No hearth fire, no chimney flame, no ashes. Some said it hovered just above the eaves, a light mist that refused to disperse. Farmers called it unnatural. The local preacher, Reverend Hale, noted in a letter, "Her door never shut against the sun, yet smoke curls in patterns no fire could make. The widow counts hours we do not see." Children, drawn by curiosity, crept near the fence to watch her. Margaret never chased them away. Sometimes she would lift a hand in greeting. Sometimes she would continue reading psalms aloud. her voice floating over fields cracked by drought. One afternoon, a traveling photographer returned to Ash Hollow and captured something remarkable. A double exposure showing Margaret twice in the same frame. Once seated at the window, reading, and again standing in the parlor doorway. The townsfolk who glimpsed the photograph were unsettled. Some whispered that Margaret existed partially outside the flow of time, that the hollow itself obeyed her presence. By midsummer, the townsfolk's reactions had hardened. Churchgoers debated whether she was a saint or a sinner. Farmers feared that any interaction with her might bring misfortune. Letters from the post office noted unusual deliveries, strange packages, sometimes ashes, sometimes powders, and always unsigned. The hollow seemed to respond, its gray river moving slower in her presence, its trees swaying as if to watch her, not the wind. Evening rituals remained constant. The handbell rang at dusk. Smoke, impossibly pale and unmoving, curled above the roof. And always, the hollow seemed to breathe in her rhythm, waiting for something no one dared name. Reflection. In the quietest of routines, the extraordinary often hides, shaping both land and legend in silence. Missouri, late summer 1889. The drought had reached its height, and Ash Hollow seemed suspended in a faint haze of heat and expectation. The river lay low, the soil cracked, and the hollow's edges shimmered in the midday sun. Margaret Vale remained at the parsonage, her presence constant yet enigmatic. Smoke continued to rise from the parsonage roof, thin, pale, and unmoving. Farmers who walked the ridge above the valley swore it had patterns, curling in shapes that resembled letters or symbols. Reverend Hale noted in another letter, "The smoke forms shapes no hand could make. It lingers as though aware of us. I cannot read it, yet I feel its meaning." Neighbors began recording observations. Children marked the hours of her rituals with chalk on fences. A bell at dusk, smoke appearing and vanishing, Margaret reading psalms aloud as the sun sank behind the hills. One elderly woman swore she saw Margaret in two places at once bending over the garden, once standing at the parlor window, though no one else was nearby. Ledger entries became increasingly peculiar. Oil, salt, blank paper, and powders whose purpose was never documented. Some pages bore coded notes, others, simple symbols. A historian who later examined the ledgers wrote, "It is as if she prepared for correspondence with a world beyond the visible." Townsfolk began to speak in hushed tones of her power, her curse, or her blessing. Churchgoers came to the edge of the valley, hoping for a glimpse, praying she might intercede for their souls. Farmers avoided her paths, muttering about bad omens and unnatural fires. The parsonage became both sanctuary and puzzle, a place where the ordinary and the inexplicable coexisted. The most unsettling event that summer arrived on a still August evening. Smoke rose higher than usual, pale against the deepening sky, twisting into shapes like fingers or reaching arms. Margaret rang the bell 3 times, louder than ever. Children ran home. The river's surface shimmered unnaturally, and no one dared approach. The hollow seemed to hold its breath. Evening descended, gray and silent. The bell's last note echoed across the valley, fading into the dark. And when the townsfolk awoke the next morning, whispers had solidified into legend. Margaret Vale was no ordinary widow, and Ash Hollow was no ordinary place. Reflection. Suspicion thrives where mystery lingers, and some truths are measured not in sight, but in shadow. Missouri, October 1889. The year had grown long, the sun slanting low across Ash Hollow, casting long shadows over cracked fields and skeletal trees. The river, swollen from late rains, churned with gray-brown urgency, carrying debris from the hills. The hollow seemed to shiver in anticipation, as if aware that the ordinary laws of time and place were about to falter. Margaret Vale moved with calm precision inside the parsonage, her days of ritual now more urgent. Ledger fragments show oil purchases increased, lamps polished and placed in every window, salt-lined thresholds in patterns not recorded anywhere else, blank paper stacked ready, as if she expected messages, though none ever came. She rang her handbell at dusk, its metallic note carrying farther than ever, as if calling the hollow itself to attention. Locals noticed changes in the air. The usual stillness of Ash Hollow seemed strained. Birds fell silent. Winds shifted unexpectedly, tossing leaves in swirling patterns. Thin smoke appeared from the roof, curling unnaturally, resisting the breeze, lingering in forms that suggested urgency, shapes that some swore resembled hands reaching, or spirals that mirrored the river's flow below. As evening darkened, storm clouds gathered, rolling low and heavy above the ridges. Farmers hurried home, children were kept indoors, and even the town preacher, Reverend Hale, watched from the ridge, uneasy. He noted in a letter, "The wind carries whispers tonight, though no one speaks. Margaret's bell tolls, but it is not the hour of dusk. Something waits." Lightning flashed across the hollow, illuminating the parsonage in stark relief. The house appeared untouched by the gathering chaos outside, its walls pale against the darkened sky. Rain began to fall in sheets, turning dirt paths into mud, swelling the gray river to frightening proportions. Yet Margaret's presence remained steadfast. Inside, the lamps burned, the bell's chime rang out, and the smoke persisted, curling without flame. Neighbors attempted to approach, fearing flooding and damage, but each step toward the parsonage seemed resisted by some unseen force. Reports would later record, "We could see her through the windows, yet the door would not open. Lamps were lit, yet the wind and rain could not reach them. Smoke rose as always, but the fire inside could not be found." By nightfall, the storm reached its height. The river threatened to breach its banks. Lightning split trees across the hollow, and Margaret Vale was nowhere to be found. The lamps burned, the bell tolled, the smoke hung, and in the midst of it all, Ash Hollow held its breath, witnessing an event no ledge, or letter or photograph could fully record. Reflection. Some nights are so long they stretch the boundaries between presence and absence, leaving only echoes behind. Missouri, late October 1889. The storm had passed, leaving Ash Hollow soaked, mud-laden, and eerily silent. The river had surged, swallowing low-lying fields and bending fences, yet the parsonage stood untouched, its walls dry, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Neighbors approached cautiously. The once familiar paths were now waterlogged, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil and smoke that still lingered above the parsonage roof. Yet inside, Margaret Vale could not be found. The door was locked from the inside, its key missing. Lamps remained burning, their flames steady despite the damp. A faint curl of smoke drifted from the roof, though no hearth had been lit. Official records, conflict. One report reads, "No occupant found in parsonage. House undisturbed. Lamps lit. Soot present, yet no fire burns." Another entry claims, "Door locked from within. Windows intact. Smoke observed, but origin unknown. Resident absent." Neighbors swore they heard the handbell ring at the usual hour, even though no one was inside to toll it. It continued for 9 nights, each chime carrying farther than the last, echoing across the hollow and the swollen river. After the 9th night, silence fell, not sudden, but deliberate, as if the valley itself waited for the next chapter of the story. Children whispered of glimpses in windows, shapes bending light, shadows moving where no one stood. Farmers avoided the hollow after dusk, swearing they could feel unseen eyes tracking them across the fields. Reverend Hale, who had watched the events unfold from the ridge, wrote in trembling ink, "It is as if she has become part of the hollow itself. The fires, the smoke, the bell, They speak in her absence. Photographs taken after the storm showed the parsonage unchanged, lamps glowing, yet no figure within. Smoke rose in impossible angles, curling against gravity. Letters circa, laid in town, unsigned, describing shadows of a woman moving along the ridge, then disappearing into the mist. By the end of the month, Ash Hollow had transformed. Margaret Vale's disappearance was no longer a question of record. It was a question of legend. The valley remembered her rituals, her smoke, her bell, even as the woman herself had vanished. Reflection. Absence can leave traces stronger than presence. Sometimes, a person becomes the landscape itself. Missouri, November 1889. The storm had left Ash Hollow transformed. Mud clung to the riverbanks, trees lay splintered, and the valley was quieter than it had ever been. Yet the parsonage remained unchanged, its windows lit, the lamps steady, and smoke curling impossibly above the roofline. Neighbors reported strange phenomena. Children claimed to see shadows moving behind curtained windows. Farmers said they could feel eyes upon them as they worked. The handbell continued to toll at dusk, though no human hand pulled the clapper. It rang for 9 nights, then ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm itself. Letters and journals from the town contained conflicting accounts. One entry notes, "She is gone, yet the house remains. Lamps lit, smoke rising. Impossible." Another reads, "We passed the hollow and saw the bell swing in the empty tower. No wind moved it, no one there. Attempts to enter the parsonage failed. Doors remained locked, keys vanished, windows unbroken. Smoke lingered as if caught in invisible threads, curling in spirals, forming shapes that some swore resembled human figures. The river, gray and swollen, seemed to mirror the hollow's new rhythm, a place where ordinary rules no longer applied." As news of the disappearance spread, Ash Hollow became a locus of rumor. Churchgoers whispered that Margaret Vale had been taken by divine providence. Farmers muttered Q's under their breath. Children dared each other to approach the parsonage, but few ever did. Even Reverend Hale, cautious and devout, admitted in a letter, "I do not know if she is alive, dead, or something else. I only know that Ash Hollow watches and waits and remembers." By the month's end, the valley itself had begun its slow transformation from a mere place into a legend. Margaret Vale, the widow, was absent, but every ritual she had performed, every smoke curl, every bell toll, had left an imprint. The townsfolk spoke of her in hushed reverence and fear, the line between fact and myth already blurring. Reflection. Sometimes a single night stretches far beyond its hours, leaving stories that the living can only attempt to follow. Missouri, early 1900s. 2 decades had passed since the storm of 1889. Ash Hollow was quieter now, the river slower, the ridges overgrown with brush that had long since claimed the abandoned fields. The parsonage remained, a stubborn relic of an era that had witnessed something extraordinary. Yet Margaret Vale was gone. No trace remained of the woman herself, only the records, the ledgers, and the stories that refused to die. Historians of the period began collecting testimony. Letters, diaries, and interviews surfaced, each offering fragments, often contradictory. One ledger, labeled Widow Vale, Cemetery Plot Number 0, showed handwriting unlike any known correspondent in the town. Oil and salt purchases were noted again, alongside cryptic symbols that historians could not decipher. A postmaster recalled, "She ordered blank paper by the ream, but never sent a single letter. The paper disappeared. Some say she wrote to the wind." Accounts from neighbors conflicted. One claimed the bell continued to toll nightly for 9 days after her disappearance. Another insisted no sound had been heard. Some photographs seemed to capture smoke in unnatural forms, yet none could verify what had caused them. One itinerant photographer swore he had captured her twice in a single frame, yet the images, Authenticity was debated. By the 1940s, the story had reached the airwaves. A radio broadcast mentioned, "In Ash Hollow, ashes fall upward, smoke curls against reason, and the widow is said to move where none can see." Folklorists began comparing Margaret Vale to other figures of frontier myth. The Mary of the Plains stories, tales of women who vanished yet lingered in the land, were invoked. Margaret's rituals, her bell, her smoke, once peculiar behaviors, were now interpreted as omens, symbols, and signs. Ash Hollow was no longer a simple valley. It was a vessel of legend, shaped as much by the land as by the stories the living insisted on telling. Yet even in reflection, scholars cautioned. The ledgers contained contradictions. Letters suggested impossible events. Photographs defied logic. And still, the hollow preserved these traces, as if waiting for someone to reconcile memory and reality, myth and fact. Reflection. Sometimes, records outlast witnesses, and myths are born where contradictions linger. Missouri, 1920s, 1950s. Decades had layered over Ash Hollow, leaving the valley at once familiar and strange. The parsonage stood, empty yet meticulously preserved by nature itself, windows intact, the garden overrun, but the stonework stubbornly resisting decay. Margaret Vale's presence was absent, yet everywhere it lingered. In smoke patterns reported by farmers, in faded photographs, in ledgers of purchases long forgotten. Local historians and folklorists began systematically recording oral testimonies. One elderly woman recalled seeing Margaret ring her handbell each evening, while another insisted she had witnessed smoke rising and curling in shapes, like hands reaching for the sky. Some townsfolk had begun leaving notes pinned to trees, recounting what they remembered as fact. Yet no two accounts agreed. A peculiar document surfaced from 1940, a radio interview with a Missouri historian, describing Ash Hollow as a place where ashes fall upward, smoke curls against reason, and a widow counts hours not measured by clocks. These words, broadcast to a wide audience, amplified the hollow's reputation beyond the valley. Scholars began comparing Margaret Vale to frontier legends like the Mary of the Plains, women who existed simultaneously in fact and myth, whose acts became intertwined with the land itself. By 1951, local authorities formally recognized the name Ash Hollow, cementing Margaret Vale's influence on the geography of the valley. The legend became inseparable from the physical place. Stories of smoke, bell, and unseen presence were no longer whispered. They were written, recorded, and studied. Yet contradictions persisted. Ledgers showed purchases that could not be explained. Photographs captured what seemed impossible. Witnesses' memories conflicted. Scholars noted, Margaret Vale is not simply absent, she is unresolved. Ash Hollow preserves contradictions, as if they were sacred. The valley had become a mirror for human imagination. What had been a woman's private rituals were now mythic symbols, examined, debated, and remembered. The line between history and folklore blurred, leaving only traces for those willing to search, interpret, and wonder. Reflection. When evidence conflicts and memory falters, myth is the map we follow to understand what once was. Missouri, 2024. More than a century had passed since Margaret Vale disappeared into Ash Hollow, yet the valley remained. The river still flowed gray after rains, the ridges still rose fractured and uneven, and the parsonage stubbornly persisted, windows intact, bell tower silent but looming. Nature had reclaimed the garden, but the walls held a strange reverence, as if aware of the stories embedded in their timber. A modern historian, Dr. Lillian Hayes, arrived with camera, notebook, and recorder. She had spent years researching frontier legends, examining letters, ledgers, photographs, and oral histories. Her goal was not sensationalism, it was understanding, attempting to separate fact from folklore in a place where time seemed reluctant to move. As she approached the parsonage, she noticed subtle signs that past and present coexisted here. The handbell, half buried near the porch, gleamed faintly in the morning light. Smoke stains marred the roofline, though no fire had burned for decades. A slight metallic hum seemed to echo faintly from the walls, almost like a distant chime carried in the wind. Dr. Hayes opened the ledgers, now preserved in the local archive. Oil purchases, salt measurements, and cryptic notations were carefully documented. Blank sheets of paper, carefully folded and stored, hinted at messages that were never sent. Photographs of Margaret captured her presence twice in one frame, once by the window, once in the doorway. Still defying explanation, locals still whispered about the hollow. Children dared each other to approach the parsonage, though none stayed long. Farmers swore they felt a presence watching from the woods. Even after a century, the valley itself seemed attuned to Margaret Vale, as if her rituals had left traces too persistent to erase. Dr. Hayes recorded ambient sounds late at night. At 2 a.m., a faint metallic hum resonated through the parlor floorboards, low and persistent. She rang the handbell herself. Its tone seemed to awaken a memory in the hollow, a resonance older than the walls themselves. It was a quiet echo, a reminder that even absence can leave presence in its wake. Reflection. Sometimes what we seek is not simply evidence, but a sense of understanding that bridges past and present, presence and memory. Missouri, dawn, 2024. The first light of day stretched over Ash Hollow, brushing the gray river with pale gold. The parsonage, steadfast through centuries, glowed faintly in the rising sun. Dr. Lillian Hayes stood at the edge of the garden, notebook closed, camera resting by her side. The hollow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for recognition rather than action. The handbell, half buried for decades, now lay in her hands. Its surface was worn, dulled by time and soil, yet it retained a weight both physical and symbolic. When she lifted it, a faint resonance filled the air, like an echo of Margaret Vale's daily ritual, long ago. The metallic hum recorded at 2 a.m. seemed to respond, vibrating subtly beneath her fingertips. Dr. Hayes walked the perimeter of the parsonage. Smoke stains marred the roofline, twisted trees leaned as if watching, and the gray river flowed with the same deliberate patience it had shown for generations. She reflected on what had been recorded. Ledgers, letters, photographs, oral histories. The accounts conflicted, yet a coherent presence persisted. Not fully human, not fully myth. Margaret Vale had left traces that were felt as much as observed. Sitting on a fallen log, Dr. Hayes listened. The hollow was quiet, save for the river, the wind, and the faint memory of a bell tolling long ago. She wondered, had Margaret counted the hours of her own sorrow, or had she counted something greater, something of the hollow itself? As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the valley, she set the handbell gently on the parsonage steps. The gray river reflected the light of day, and the hollow seemed to exhale, finally at peace. The smoke, the bell, the shadows, they were part of a story that transcended time, a rhythm Margaret Vale had begun and which the valley continued to honor. Final reflection. Every fire leaves light somewhere. Sometimes it waits in the ground, in the river, in the echoes of a bell, and in the quiet memory of a valley that remembers more than we ever will.